Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Making Milestones podcast. Sorry if I sound like not quite right because I've been pretty sick the last several days. Today I'm on an upswing. Let's hope that I'm actually getting better. Scout also has something to say, apparently. She says, meow, Phoebe, get away from me, she says. But thank you for sharing your opinion, Scout, in this podcast. And Phoebe, leave the cat alone. Okay, sorry about that. But yeah, thank you for coming back yet again. And I'm going to try to be more consistent this year. I know I said that last year and then I just dipped for like all of December. But today's podcast episode is one that's kind of close to my heart that I think is like a really important topic to discuss. And it's the loneliness of the journey, like when you start to shift your horsemanship perspectives and like how you approach horse training and just like having a horse and working with horses in general. When you start to see that internal shift and that big paradigm shift in your life, the shifts that it has inevitably with like your friendships and other parts of your life and how lonely that journey can actually be, because it goes so far beyond just like altering how you perceive the horse world. It tends to have an impact on how you perceive the world as a whole. And even outside of that, a lot of us have made connections with people as friends within the horse world where we've met them through the shared love of horses, or we'll have mentors who we really love and respect that are in the horse world. And when we start to have these internal shifts in how we perceive the horse world, and we start to grow past a point where those people are at currently, it can create a lot of tension, and it can end up having these relationships that you thought would be long lasting and untouchable, and create a situation where these relationships are no more, and where it can inevitably impact relationships to the point where you lose these friendships, or where your mentors and you no longer see eye to eye to such a degree where you can't continue on under their mentorship. So it can be really lonely because it's a process where you're starting to question a lot of the things that you've been taught in the horse world and a lot of the things that you're seeing. And that's creating insecurity and uncertainty. And then on top of that, you also have these friendships and relationships that are kind of just gradually tapering off and no longer being so centralized to your life. And then that can be really lonely too, because these people that you would have once thought would be around for years upon years of your life and that you didn't really see a life without at this point are no longer there because they're not growing with you. And I think that's a really important topic, because I find that that's one of the biggest deterrents for people starting to shift their perspectives, is the lack of acceptance of that perspective from people around them who aren't seeing the same shift. Because ultimately, if you have friends who are into horses and who see things differently, and honestly, even if they're not horse people, if they just have a different perspective on how you handle animals, if those viewpoints are not in alignment, then it creates tension, especially if the person isn't really set in their viewpoint and they aren't secure enough to maintain that perspective without validation. So then even if you're not like preaching to them or telling them what to do, you just existing and being who you are and feeling how you feel and making the changes that you are is a trigger to them. And people who aren't comfortable working through those triggers and trying to explore why they exist are going to blame you for being that trigger, and they're going to take it out on you. And then this can create animosity, it can create tension, it can create unrest in the relationship, and ultimately result in those relationships fracturing off. And when this happens, it can be really hard as the person who feels responsible for it, especially if they tell you why and they've like brought up like concerns is the wrong word, but just like a general distaste for the direction you're heading in your horsemanship. If they brought up that's upsetting to them and you know why, you can feel like, am I doing something wrong? So I wanted to talk about that because I think that like regardless, like this extends outside of the horse world in the sense that when you're seeing a big shift in like how you ground your ethics and morals, and that starts to just create wave of shifts across the course of your life. When you're seeing that, like you will lose people no matter what genre those shifts are taking place in, no matter what part of your life you're seeing these shifts in. You're going to end up outgrowing people who are not growing with you. And it will be lonely, but it is a part of the process, because I think the big takeaway there is that there's certain people who are only meant to be in your life for a season of your life and who aren't meant to be a staple in your life for an extended period of time. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that they're not important people. It doesn't mean that you can't still love them. It doesn't mean that they didn't still have an amazing influence on your life. It doesn't mean any of that stuff. It just means that they weren't meant to see their relationship through to this next version of yourself. And I think that that's something that we need to start to get more comfortable with as we develop and grow as human beings, because it can end up holding us back in our growth. And I know for me, for sure, it was a big enough deterrent, especially earlier on when I was making these changes, that it definitely did slow me down. It was like the fear of judgment from other people and like the pressure from people in my immediate life who didn't see things the same way that I did. And like, I knew how I felt in my heart, and I knew what I was comfortable with in my gut. And ultimately, like, I knew how I was feeling internally, but I allowed external influences to kind of negate that internal experience. And while it made the people around me more comfortable for a time, it resulted in me being abundantly more uncomfortable completely unnecessarily, where I was kind of fighting with this internal external struggle where I would feel a certain way internally, and then externally I would allow influences to just cause me to shrug it off and be like, okay, it's just me. And then what this results in is you're constantly deferring to the opinions of other people about your own life and about what you're comfortable with and about these things that you've been learning and reading about when they haven't necessarily done that. And it's important to consider other perspectives, but I also think that we need to learn how to develop to the point where we're so grounded in who we are that we can maintain a perspective even in the absence of validation of people around us. And that's something that's really hard to do. And it's something that I think everyone struggles with. And I think it's kind of the crux of what I'm trying to get into talking about, even with the people that you lose through this journey. Part of the reason why you lose those people is because they're not grounded in their beliefs and who they are. And you are creating like a disruption in that foundation of who they thought they were, and they're not comfortable with it. And instead of working through those feelings and looking at what they actually mean and what they say about how they feel about the horse world, they blame you for being the trigger to start all of that. And it's not fair to you per se, because it's not your fault that they feel that way. Like, you can't control their feelings, but at the same time, like, if you're a constant trigger to someone and it's changing how they treat you, it's not really a healthy situation for either one of you to stay in. So this is kind of the less talked about process, I guess, of like making these shifts in horsemanship. And the specific shifts that I'm really talking about are going into, like, if you're going from traditional horsemanship into more evidence-based horsemanship, whether you use pressure and release or positive reinforcement, it's about the shift that's taking place where you're starting to say no to traditional practices that you view as too harsh or unkind to the horse or pointless or unproductive or unethical, ineffective. And you're swaying away from that and starting to speak out against these things that, while they might still be common and while they've been tradition for years, you don't agree with them. And especially when you're a young person doing this, this is difficult too, because you'll have people who are older than you attempt to discredit you on the basis that you've lived less years than them. And this can also be really invalidating, and it can disable this journey that you're going on, because you'll start to question and doubt yourself and be like, well, they have lived on this earth longer than me. They have been around horses longer than me. Like, what if they do know more? And then you start to have doubt in these things that you've learned, even when you've been approaching information with an open mind and when you've been fact checking things and you've been looking into credible resources. You start to have doubt because someone who's lived longer than you is telling you that you know inherently less because you're young. And that right there is another layer to this that I caution people to watch out for, because while age can bring experience and it does give you more time to gain that experience, it's a limiting factor when you're aging with the mentality that you already know a lot, and that your age means that you're inherently more knowledgeable than anyone younger than you. That is a really dangerous mindset to hold, because there's a lot of people who are younger who've lived less years on the planet that have really insightful thought processes and who just think in such a different way that they come to conclusions that people older than them weren't able to do at that age. And you also have to consider the fact too that, like, especially in this day and age, everyone who is in the generations above my own. Like, I'm right on the cusp of being a millennial and Gen Z. Like, I think I'm the very last year that is counted as being a millennial. So I kind of identify with both generations. But when you look at the generations above us, and even for like millennials, for a good portion of their early childhood, we had such a lack of access to like the internet and being able to fact check things and look at different resources and access the wealth of information that we have today, that we couldn't learn at as accelerated of a rate. And that's even more true for people who are pre-internet. So we have these people who are speaking as if they are the voice of reason on everything, who haven't done the same amount of learning that people younger than them have done, because as soon as that information started to become accessible, they were already rejecting it because they were already set in their ways. And that's a problem that we're starting to see within those generations, where they have this perspective that they are all knowing because they're older than the younger generations, but they're actually being outpaced by young people who have a thirst for knowledge, that are looking these things up and don't have the same decades worth of biased information that they've been fed. And it's just a really interesting shift to watch happen, because you can actually see like the reaction from these people in the older generations and how angry they get. They feel like they are being slighted by young people by not being immediately given the authority in any position that they're talking about these things on. And it's going to be a shift that we're continuing to see, because the more young people that start to go this path where they're changing the way of doing things with horses, and they're no longer just pledging allegiance basically to the perspectives of people older than them simply because they're older, we're going to see the people who have used their age as a method of getting viewed as an authority figure start to really like unthread and become really upset. And we're already seeing that today. So a lot of this, like, I think part of this journey that people go on, like, a lot of it is learning how to become so grounded in yourself that you don't need validation from other people to the same extent. And I was thinking about this today while I was like feeding my animals their breakfast this morning. I was thinking about how a lot of my closest friends that I can share the most with and I talk to the most don't live right close to me. Or if they do, they're really busy with their own things and careers with hours that conflict with mine, and I don't get to see them very often. But a lot of the friends that I feel the safest and most grounded around and that I can share the most with don't live close to me. And I was pondering this for a second, and I was like, I wonder like why that is. And like part of it is just because our life paths have led down different routes. But I do wonder, like, if you believe in some sort of organization to the universe, I was thinking that if all of my friends had been like immediately accessible to me at all times, where I could lean on them and use them as like a crutch throughout this growing journey, I don't think I would have learned the same degree from it. I think that part of this journey, I had to be in some level of isolation and learn how to find validation in myself and learn how to enjoy my own company rather than using people as a crutch to avoid being alone with myself and my thoughts, and use them as a crutch to avoid the discomfort of not being validated by other people or having my feelings hurt. And I think that was a necessary part of my journey, is to do a lot of it alone and to learn how to be comfortable alone. Because if I was always surrounded by other beings to validate me, it wouldn't have forced me to create that validation for myself in the same capacity. And I was just thinking about this morning, and I do think that that's what it is, or it's what I have made it, because I guess life is what you make it. Like, not to sound like Hannah Montana, but also low key, yes. And so when we're going through these stages of development where we're shifting our mindset in the horse world, I think that's a huge thing to look at, is like being lonely isn't a bad thing necessarily. It can be a period of growth and learning, and you can learn a lot about yourself in that loneliness. And this isn't to downplay how much it actually sucks, because it sucks being lonely. It's a really hard process to go through all of this and to like lose those close ties to friends in the horse world, and to have people perhaps be like whispering behind your back and kind of condemning what you're doing and just like looking down on you. But I think an important way to look at it is that like all of that is coming from a place of their own insecurity. the type of friend who fully supports you in your journey, they might not necessarily agree with everything that you do, and they might not have the same path themselves, but they're not going to have ill will on you, and they're going to just let you figure out stuff on your own so long as you're not hurting anyone. So people who feel the need to like gossip about you and kind of put down what you're doing, they're coming from a place of insecurity. And that speaks volumes about where they are at in their own journey. And it's like easier said than done. Like for me to just be like, oh, don't take it personally, validate yourself. Like that's easier said than done. It does take a lot of practice. Like there is a lot of times where I've been going through these shifts in my life where someone will say or do something, or I'll find out something that they've said or done about me. And it just takes the wind out of your sails, and you just feel like crap, and you go crashing down, and then you're just like, wow, I feel like a failure. I feel not good enough. And you start to have all this self-limiting talk, and it's really hard. It can be really depressing. And I think that acknowledging that is part of the process too, because something being hard or being sad or being uncomfortable doesn't make it a bad thing. And there's a lot of discomfort that comes with choosing to do things a different way and to go against the status quo, again, in any capacity, not just within the horse world. It's going to be uncomfortable because you're threatening the neutral kind of boring situation that people have immersed themselves in, where they've normalized that this is the way things are, and then it lets themselves off the hook where they don't have to question things. So then when you go against that, your act of resistance and going against that is inevitably going to make some people question things. It's going to put question in their minds, because they're going to just, you don't even have to say anything. You could just be doing your own thing, being who you are. You don't even have to say why you are no longer going with tradition. The act of you no longer just going along with this is the way things are, this is the way they always have been, and instead creating your own path calls other people to question whether or not that's the right path for them. And then it pushes them in a situation where they have to feel uncomfortable and where they have to feel unsure, and where, depending on how deeply they question it, it can raise a lot of uncomfortable questions and bring them to uncomfortable conclusions. And a lot of people in this world are not ready to do that because it is so uncomfortable. So if you're in a state of discomfort and you feel like everything is all up in the air and that you don't know where you're headed, like I would say that's a normal part of the process. And I do think that something that I've learned that's really valuable through all of these uncomfortable feelings and like feelings of uncertainty and feeling invalidated and feeling not good enough and just feeling really sad and depressed, there is a beautiful lesson that I have learned amongst that. And I would say that it's learning that you can feel that way and come out of it and feel better after. Like there's been moments where I felt so sad and so worthless that I haven't been able to get out of bed, and where I felt like the pain is never going to go away and I don't see an out and I don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. And it's just been all consuming. There's been moments where I felt so deeply that way. And looking back, like I actually am grateful for those moments, because they taught me valuable lessons about like my level of emotional resilience, and that I can feel those bad feelings that deeply, but then I can also feel joy really deeply, and that I can also feel joy really deeply after feeling that depth of sadness. And what it's taught me is that sometimes you do need to sit with those feelings of discomfort, and it'll bring you to a better area in life. Whereas if you try to run from them and you try to stay where you're not meant to be, it might be a lower level of discomfort, but it's longer and more prolonged. And in the long run, it's going to deplete your energy and make you far less happy than what dealing with that temporary depth of like despair would. So sometimes like the only way out is through, and you just need to feel crappy things and just push through and just believe that there is something better on the other side. And if you can do that, it can bring you to new conclusions that you didn't even see possible. Like that's the thing with me, with this whole process of like shifting how I do my horsemanship and just shifting how I see the world in general, and just kind of like finding who I really am and becoming my more authentic self. It's been like a process where I don't know where the destination is. Like there's certain things that I know that I deeply want and have for years, and that have always stayed the same. And that's true. But with like horse training and whatnot, when I started training horses professionally, if you asked me at the beginning of this, I would have scoffed at the idea of becoming the person that I am now. And I would have mocked that person, and I would have thought it was extremist. And I would have responded in the same way that a lot of the people who look at my content today do, because I wasn't ready for it. But that doesn't mean that I'm regretful of the path that I've been led on. But the point that I'm trying to make is that you don't really need to have a destination or an idea of where you're headed to know that it's the right direction for you, and you can just trust the process. And this sounds like so gimmicky and like self-help person, like one of those influencers that's just here to like try to inspire you and just be like, trust the process, manifest. But it is to some extent actually true. Because the way you see yourself and your self-talk and the belief systems that you say all in your head, like even if it's never said externally, it absolutely does impact the way that you see everything. And when even one thing starts to shift out of that mindset, it's like a domino effect, and it sets off a series of changes that can change your life as you know it. And it's just like, it's a really incredible thing. And it's like such a beautiful process. So I would encourage people to not fear the feeling bad for a time, and just to learn how to sit with it and feel it. Like, don't try to push the emotions away, like feel them, which sucks. And like, honestly, even as I'm saying this, it's like the next time I feel really deeply crappy, I usually do try to look for an escape, at least initially, because no one wants to feel crappy. And it's just like, it's the human experience. But since I've done this enough times now, like I do know that in the long run, it is better to just work through it, and to sometimes, like, it's not about finding immediate solutions. It's just about feeling your feelings and processing them, and then letting the solutions find you. And that sounds so cheesy, but it's true. So if you're on a path right now where you're feeling like really lonely and like uncertain, my greatest advice that I could give to you is to just embrace it and recognize the fact that the lesson you might be needing to learn now is how to love yourself enough and how to find home within yourself without having other people and their validation anchoring you to this earth. And this isn't to say that you should just be like individualist and not have anyone in your life, because we need community. We need community support. We need friends. We need loved ones, you know, like we need all of that. So it's a good thing, but it's like those people should be a nice, fun bonus to your life. They shouldn't be the center of it. Like, you should be the center of it. You should be grounded within yourself and be able to find peace and enjoyment in doing things with yourself and thinking things, and not necessarily have the outward support from all of these people in your life. So it's not about being so lonely that you just become a recluse so that you don't interact with anyone or anything. It's about learning how to validate yourself and love yourself enough that you can find comfort in your own ability and your own unique perspective on the world, and cherish that. So I guess like the purpose of this podcast episode is to really just emphasize the fact that losing friends or people that you'd been connected to in the process of your own personal growth and development isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, I would really work on being reflective enough that you could actually look at the situation and go like, did I do something unkind or to hurt them, or like, am I being a problem? Because a lot of this like self-development, self-growth talk can also be used in a manipulative or deceptive manner, where you're essentially using therapy talk to justify harmful behavior. But when it's related to your own choices in your life, like with your horses and your animals, and like the shifts that you're making and how you perceive that, if other people deeply have an issue with that, when it's harmless and you're not hurting anyone or anything in the process, usually that the issue is within them. So I would encourage people to embrace the loneliness and to like make loneliness your friend, and just like within that loneliness, like for example, let's say all of your friends in your life are horse people and you decide that you want to go into rewards-based training and science-based training, and they all train super traditionally, and the stuff that you're doing with your horse makes them feel threatened now and they don't like it, and it's creating discomfort in them, and then they're taking that out on you, and you're getting invited out less and you're getting included in less things. Let's say that that's what's happening. in that extra time that you have away from these friends, why not find new hobbies that you can do that you enjoy doing? Like for me, one of the big things was hiking. And like, I cannot stress this enough. I never used to go hiking really at all. And like, when I did, I sure as heck would not go alone at all. Like, I would never think to go, I'm going to go on a hike today. Like, if I asked around and no one wanted to go with me, I wouldn't go. But in prioritizing hiking and just going and taking my dog out with me and going regardless of whether or not I have company, I've actually realized that I prefer hiking alone. Like I enjoy solo hiking more times than I do that with hiking with someone. And also, like, the other thing to note with the hiking too is that initially, like, when it was really, really difficult for me and I was having like a hard time physically with the level of exertion of the hikes, it was less fun. But what I did notice is that if I went on a hike when I was feeling stressed or upset, I always felt better after. I always felt happier and more settled and more relaxed. And that made it reinforcing. So sometimes when you start to do these things, you might need to do them a few times before you can actually see how reinforcing it is. And it can be really hard when you're feeling really crappy and you're just wanting to be in a freeze state and lay in bed. It can be really hard to make yourself go out there and do it. But if you can manage to just get yourself out and like start small. Like for me, when I started hiking, it's like, okay, I'm going to go for a walk like down the street. It wasn't even really a hike at that point, but it's like, I feel stressed. I'm going to go for a walk. And then if you go and do that, and then you realize after the fact, like, hey, I feel less stressed when I go for a walk, then you're reinforcing that behavior because it's changing your emotional state in a good way. And you don't get that reinforcement unless you take the first step, which is doing what you don't want to do, which is going into that uncomfortable state of having to get out of bed, put on your outdoor clothes, and go for a walk. And similarly, like this is what I'm working on next for myself, which is a lot of it's like social related. I have a lot of social anxiety. So like putting myself out there to like make friends and like talk to people and like do things like that can be really difficult, but because of the fear of rejection. But if you never do it, you're rejecting yourself and you're never putting yourself in a situation where you can be reinforced by the person responding well and doing what you want and like responding in the way that you want. So you just need to put yourself out there. Because if you don't try, it's never going to happen. So there's like lots of different moving parts for like how I'm trying to work on implement these changes where it's like I've gone through like a period of isolation to some extent since this growth. And like it's relative isolation because I think even for those of you who might be listening to this and feeling very isolated, there's probably some people in your life, even if they're on the outskirts and even if you don't connect with them a lot, that have been a consistent supporter, even if it's from afar. It doesn't even need to be a family member. It doesn't even need to be a friend. It can be someone online that you met online that has just been a supportive person in your comment section for a time. Like, and even if they're not there, it's like, then maybe it's because they haven't been given the chance to be there. But what I'm saying is that if you're open to it and if you look around, generally speaking, you can think of someone, whether they're still in your life or not, who has been like a supporter and like an advocate for you in your life and that you remember because it mattered to you. And so for me, like through this period of isolation, like I had people who were like that. And now I'm kind of coming more out of that isolation. I'm trying to prioritize making new connections, but like having them be more aligned with like what I want. So like what that means is like, if I want to find people who are aligned with like who I truly am, then I have to truly be myself. Like there's no room for me to be someone else and be like try to put on a mask and be who I think people will like rather than who I actually am. And that's a vulnerable situation to be in because if you are changing aspects of yourself out of fear of people judging you for them, then when you stop doing that, you start to just be yourself. It runs the risk of being rejected for who you truly are, which hurts a lot more than being rejected for your mask. But this opens the door for you to create a community of people who are actually the most supportive of you and who actually truly love you for who you are and are the most invested in being there for you and who you are. So what this means to me is that it's all about like embracing your true self, and also like whether it's for the good and the bad. Like if you're not as good version of yourself, which I mean, if we're looking from like a future perspective, all of us are going to be not as good of a version of ourselves, but embrace yourself through your flaws, through your failures, and believe in your capacity to shift as needed and become a better person. Because the more you can realize, like, I can pivot when I'm wrong, and like I've already, like, I had an ego death when I was going through all of my shifts in the horse world and changing my belief systems. And it's like I had to change so much of what I believed and basically completely reconstruct who I was as a person, especially since my identity was so associated with horses, that it's like after that, like the idea of having to admit that I was wrong and shifting again in a big way doesn't scare me as much. So like I'm comfortable and open to doing that. Like I'm sure there's lots of aspects of my character now that I'm going to look back on in a few years and have shifted and developed and changed. But like that's the nature of growth. And again, like that's something that people need to start to look at without shame, because we're taught to view like our mistakes with shame and admitting that we're wrong with shame, when really the shame is in not admitting that you're wrong and not self-reflecting and refusing to do so continuously, even in the presence of things that expose the need for that to you. And that's really what we should be ashamed of. Or like honestly, not even that. We shouldn't really be ashamed of anything, but like the biggest risk is to never grow and never self-reflect and continue doubling down and defending stuff. So start to look at like you being able to admit that you're wrong as a strength, because what it also does is people who use your mistakes against you and they use them to try to make you feel ashamed of yourself. If you're already owning your mistakes, you've effectively unloaded the shame gun that they're trying to shoot at you. They can't get at you and try to mock you for your mistakes if you're already aware of them and you're owning them, and they don't know what to do with that. It is such a power move. And I highly, highly recommend trying it out because it works really well. And people don't know what to do with themselves when you're just like, yeah, you're right. I used to do that and I don't anymore. Or like, I'm working on that. And yeah. And it can be hard to do consistently. So this isn't to like stand on a moral high ground and be like, I'm so like attuned now that I never get defensive, because that would be such a freaking lie. But it's just learning how to do it more, and also just like being more open about your mistakes. Like me posting my failures as an equestrian over the years and like talking about the stuff that I did wrong has been such a power move, and also just like cathartic for me, because it, one, shows that I'm acknowledging my mistakes, which makes it more comfortable, hopefully, for people to acknowledge their own. But two, it's a way for me to look back at mistakes that I've made and like take ownership of them. And since I don't have a time machine and I can't go back and fix them, that's all I can do now. So it makes me feel like I'm doing what I can in the moment to try to make a difference there. And that's really all you can ask for. So yeah, this is going to be like one of the most ADHD episodes I think I've uploaded, because my brain is like running at like dial up level because of being sick. So hopefully people still like it. But yeah, basically embrace the loneliness, guys. It's part of the process, and learn how to like build a community of people who support you for who you are and who are aligned in your values and who will cheer you on and love you through your trials and tribulations and your mistakes and your wins, and just be there for you. And they don't even necessarily need to be there physically. It's better to have a small group of really high quality people than it is to have a huge quantity of people who don't actually love you for who you are and who don't have your back through the good and the bad. And like, it is really, really hard to find quality friends and people who are actually like your true ride or dies. Like they really are like one in a million. There's not very many of them. And it can be a real bummer to like not be able to have those people in your life. So if you haven't found them yet, like just keep being your most authentic version of yourself so that you can attract the right people who truly will be there for you, because there's a lot of people out there who are looking for that. And yeah. But the journey isn't meant to be one where you're in company all the time. There are going to be moments of loneliness and isolation that you have to like sit with, and maybe the stillness and the isolation is there for the purpose of having you be more reflective and having you start to notice how much you rely on other people for comfort and for validation and make changes accordingly. At least that's what it was for me. But yeah, sorry. Like I had more to say, but my brain has just turned off now. So I am happy with myself. Like if we're gonna, at the end of this episode, maybe everyone just think of something that you've done in the last week that you're proud of. That's like a shift in like your typical behavior. Like I am proud that I recorded this when I had a moment to do so, because otherwise we probably would have gone without a podcast episode this week. And I don't script any of my podcasts, or at least I haven't been. So usually it's like when I have a spur of the moment idea and then I just like talk about it, and I'm probably going to start lightly scripting them so that I don't go off on ADHD tangents as much. But I do like just having it be like a conversational thing. I'm also planning on having like more guests on my podcast this year and just kind of shifting the general tone of it, because while it's like still very horse heavy in discussion, I do think that the personal like aspect of like self-growth and self-development and our perspectives outside of the horse world have such an influencing factor on like how we show up for our horses. And I think that I would be doing horses and people a disservice to not talk about those things. So I do think that the podcast is going to shift to be a little bit more heavy on that personal growth aspect of it, while linking it to like how we show up for like people and animals in our life, because I just think that those things are so important and they're often like undervalued and underappreciated and not really referenced really when you're like in traditional lessons and stuff at all. Like your emotional state and your physical state and how it impacts your ability to ride and do stuff isn't talked about enough, and it really needs to be, because it would help avoid so many equestrians feeling like failures and feeling inadequate when they aren't at their best, when they're emotionally or physically struggling, because it's like you can't be. But there's this idea that we should be constantly productive all the time, regardless of what life's throwing at us. And that's just simply not true. It's so far from the truth that like we just really need to throw that whole mindset away, because it's toxic. And as someone who grew up in the horse world and grew up with a lot of ongoing trauma, like it impacted me in such a negative way, where I felt like a failure when it's like I had so much going on outside the barn, and like also like finances were a struggle and I couldn't afford, or my family couldn't afford as much. And I was made to feel like the issue was with me, when it was like I was a kid who was responding in a perfectly normal manner to like an abundance of trauma that I didn't know how to deal with. But the perspectives on social media and within the barn are such that it's like you should constantly be working towards the next show and constantly producing, constantly moving up the levels, and just like have your horse in a consistent work schedule. And if you don't, you're missing out and you're putting them at risk of like losing progress and stuff. And it was just like so much pressure. And like that's the other thing, is like when you choose to take that pressure off of yourself and to start to live things in a more free way, it throws the people who are still under that pressure for a loop, because they can't really fathom having horses in their life in a way where it's not like a full-time job where they have to commit to like a certain number of days each week that they're working their horse, and like having a certain number of those days be riding days and flat days and jumping days and that sort of thing. When you start to like let yourself off the hook and you don't maintain that schedule anymore, people don't really know what to do with it. Like I get people asking me all the time still like, oh, like what's your training schedule? It's like, I don't have one. I work with my horses when I can and when I feel like it and when they feel like it. And it's worked out great. Like provided your horses have adequate room to move around and they have friends, freedom, and forage, you shouldn't stress about not having a consistent training schedule. And even if you do have a consistent training schedule, the priority should be how they're living outside of that. So really the training should be less of a focus by far. But yeah, like it's like just go with the flow. And it throws people for a loop because they think that it's like haphazard and that it's not productive. But really, like it's so much healthier than like what I used to do. And I'm so glad I've started embracing it. And it's still hard some days where I'm like, oh, I really need to be doing more, or where like I've been going through a hard time mentally or physically. And I'm like, oh, like I really wish I was being more productive. Like with me being sick right now, I feel like part of that lesson too has been to learn how to be more comfortable with not being constantly productive, because like I could have done more, but I was sick enough that it made it really difficult. And I know if I pushed it, I would be sick for way longer. So I think that this sickness was kind of brought to me to help encourage me to further embrace the stillness and the slowness and go with the flow a little bit more and learn how to give myself rest when my body needs it and not keep pushing myself. And I think that was part of the purpose of it being brought to me in this way. And also just because illness is going around right now, but it's also a good lesson. So my hope is like that this next year, 2025, because I put so much work into doing things differently, that this next year will be more productive for me, in the sense that like I'll be more motivated to do these things that I want to do without there being the same level of stress and obligation attached to it because of the shifts that I've made and how I see and do things. And I'm really looking forward to that. So if you listened to this whole episode, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. I recently moved over to Spotify podcasts. So if you're interested in that, I would highly encourage you to like review the podcast on Spotify. And then also, like, if you don't mind, you can comment on the podcast episodes. I really appreciate getting podcast episode recommendations. It really helps me out a lot with like having inspiration of what to talk about and just share your thoughts. But reviewing and sharing the podcast helps more than you could imagine. It really helps push the podcast in the algorithm, and I appreciate it a lot. And I have some really cool ideas in the works for this year on the podcast. There's going to be some big changes, so just stick around. Also, if you're interested in helping support my work outside of the podcast, please check out the links in the podcast description where you can see my Patreon channel where I post tutorials and more. And there's also behind the scenes stuff, and I do monthly Q&As there. And then I also have a big clearance sale going on in my store for up to 90% off clearance items. And that's also linked down below. And then as always, I have like my webinars and whatnot online and my other pages as well. And then like liking, subscribing to the podcast, reviewing it, all of these things really, really help. Supporting my other pages helps. All of those things really help. And I appreciate it more than ever right now because I am going through a bit of a tough time after like some roommate complications that I talked about in other podcasts. So my rent has doubled, which sucks. But we'll work through it and things will be okay. So it'll all be fine. But I appreciate your help and support. Also, right now, like the podcast has no ads or sponsors being run on it. This is something that I'm looking into for the future so that I can be more viable and I can post more. So right now, the best way to support the podcast is by subscribing to Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or you can do one-time donations through PayPal, or just by subscribing, liking, sharing, etc. Or if anyone has a company or anything that they would be interested in having on a sponsored episode, feel free to contact me. Anyways, thank you everyone for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of the week, and hopefully next week I won't sound sick. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for tuning into the Making Milestones podcast this week. If you are interested in ways that you can help support the podcast, it would be greatly appreciated if you would leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help to promote the podcast in the algorithm, allowing me to connect with new listeners, and it is so greatly appreciated. Some other ways you can help to support the podcast include subscribing to my Patreon channel, where you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month and access monthly Q&As, behind-the-scenes content, training help, and more. Every subscription helps, and they help to offset any costs associated with the podcast, allowing me to keep most of these episodes ad-free. I also have an online store where I sell equestrian athletic apparel, graphic t-shirt and hoodie designs, horse bridles, both bitted and bitless, and you can check that out in the podcast description as well. Lastly, I have my main website where I have a bunch of webinars with different types of training topics, and where I also offer online training consultations if you want a one-on-one appointment with me. All of this helps me continue doing what I'm doing, and your support is so appreciated.